Okay, welcome to this next video, and we're going to be looking at the business environment in a bit more detail now, and specifically at some of the features, but it's really important to actually understand what the business environment is made up out of, and we're just looking at this on this video, and we'll discuss it in more detail in class. Okay, if we think first of all, the business environment is argued as being the sum total of all of the factors which are external to the business which greatly influence its functioning. So the business environment is the sum total of all of the factors external to the business which greatly influence its function. So it will cover factors and forces like customers, competitors, suppliers, governments, and things like the social, cultural, political, technological and legal conditions. And these will all be things we'll be exploring. Now, the business environment, as we've discussed before, is dynamic in nature, which basically means it keeps changing all the time. Now, the changes in the business environment are very unpredictable. It's very difficult to predict the exact nature of future happenings and changes in the economic and social environments. Now, the business environment does differ from place to place, region to region and country to country, and tastes and values, for example, cherished by people in India may vary very much to people in China. So all organisations are constrained by the environment they operate in, the external and the internal environments. So the external environment is basically everything outside of an organisation's boundaries that might affect it and which is not controllable by the business. So everything outside the organisation's boundaries, things which they can't control. It's generally separated into two areas: the general environment, which is a sort of broad dimension and forces of an organisation's surrounding which determine its overall context, and also the task environment, specific organisations that actually affect your organisation. Secondly, there's also the internal environment, which is basically the conditions and forces within the organisation. If we think about the general environment, it's made up of different factors that can influence the organisation in various significant ways. So if we think about the economic dimension, well, the overall health and vitality of a country's economic system in which an organisation operates. And this is really important factors for business: this general economic growth, inflation, interest rates, unemployment. And if we think about the recession which started in 2008, it caused energy and related prices to increase. As a result of this, in the business, economic growth started slowing dramatically. Unemployment started mushrooming as business after business made workforce cuts. If we think about an example of McDonald's, when you've got periods of weak economic growth, moderate unemployment and low inflation, it actually means few people eat out, and many of those that do want inexpensive options. So McDonald's can pay lower wages to attract new staff, as there's many unemployed who are looking for work, particularly part-time work. But what low inflation does mean that the cost of supplies remains constant, but they are restrained from increasing their costs. So whereas McDonald's can actually keep buying their products for the same price, they can't really put up their prices because it's low inflation. I mean, likewise, if we have weak economic dimension, it actually means that there's less funding coming in from things like taxes into the government's coffers, which actually they can then pay out to universities, hospitals for examples. So an example may well be with services shrinking. Hospitals having many low-paid patients needing attention, as fewer are now able to afford, say, private healthcare. If we look at the technological dimension, so the methods available for converting resources into products or services. Now it's important to note that although technology is applied from the organisation, it can only come from the option being available from the general environment. So for example, computer-assisted manufacture and design techniques enabled Boeing to simulate 3 miles of hydraulic tubing running through the 787 aircraft. Now as a result of this, there was decreased warehouse needs, higher quality tube fittings, lower labour costs and a major time saving. But they only could do this because actually this technological system had actually already been invented and tested elsewhere. If we think about McDonald's, that has an assembly line. It follows a predetermined path along it. Meat is cooked, the burgers assembled, the finished product is wrapped and bagged for the customers. New communication methods from social media sites such as things like Twitter and Facebook. This just used to be from computers, now it's from tablets, and also most people use it now from smartphones. So of course it's going to have a knock-on effect which is going to influence the technological dimension of a business in so many different ways. If we think about the political, the legal dimension, so we've got the government regulation of business and then the relationship between the governments and business. It's really important for 3 reasons. Firstly, because the legal system does actually partially define what an organisation can and can't do. So for example, McDonald's are subject to food preparation standards and local authority requirements, so they're obliged to do things in certain ways. Secondly, the pro or anti-business sentiment in government really does influence business. If you have a government which has a hands-off approach, which allows market forces to determine success and failure, this could actually halt the economy when industry crumbles, but then that could be blamed at lack of regulation and oversight, awakening interest for new or stricter business regulation. Equally, you may have a government that has very much a hands-on approach. And thirdly, if we think about the political stability, now no business is going to want to expand into another country unless there's good trade relationships in force. This is obviously what a lot of people are thinking about Brexit at the moment. Equally, a small business in one location may be restricted to planning regulations and taxes, particularly in the local area where the balance of political control hangs on the edge, with different parties having different ideas of how they actually want things to go. If we start looking at the task environment, well, the general environment's impact can be seen as often only being vague, imprecise and long-term, and actually many organisations tend to focus their attention on the task environment, the competitors, customers, suppliers, strategic partners, regulators. Think of competitors, other organisations which compete with it for resources. Most obviously, they're actually competing for customers' money. And if we think about Adidas are competing with Nike, and Sainsbury's with Aldi, and McDonald's with Burger King, and Costa with Starbucks, Ryanair, EasyJet, and the list goes on, competing for customers' money. And then the customers themselves, well, the customer or the person or organisation who pays money to acquire the organisation's products or services. McDonald's customers, for example, tend to be individuals, but for another company it could be a school, a hospital, a pub, a retailer, hotel, airline, very much major players, although actually as it happens, McDonald's does also supply some hospitals and prisons. If we think about the suppliers, and these are the organisations who provide resources for other organisations. So for an example, McDonald's buy their soft drink products from Coca-Cola, and perhaps the individual sauce sachets may come from HP. And Big Macs have ingredients from wholesale food processors, and napkins and sacks and wrappers, all from different packaging manufacturers. So businesses do rely on the material resources from suppliers. They also rely on the information suppliers for information, things like economic statistics, local authority for property developments, staffing from employment agencies, capital from lenders such as banks, mailing list data from data collection agencies. Some businesses strive to avoid depending entirely on particular suppliers. Why? Well, think about it. Why would you actually not want to be dependent on one supplier? We'll talk about it next week. Equally, others find it much more beneficial to create really good, strong working relationships with a single supplier. Why? Again, we'll talk about this next week in class. Let's think of strategic partners and strategic allies, where you get two companies working together in joint ventures or partnerships. If we think about Travelodge, often there's no restaurant site, and they may work with companies like Toby Carvery, who have a building next to them, who supply all the food in the bar. Equally, WH Smith's and Tesco's often have a Costa shop within their building. So, strategic partners do help companies get the expertise they lack from other companies. Although it's fair to say that most strategic partnerships are among the international companies. Ford, for example, are in partnership with Volkswagen, inasmuch as they share a distribution centre. McDonald's with Disney, so McDonald's promote the movies in store, often through the Happy Meal gifts, and Disney allows McDonald's to operate restaurants near their resorts. Let's have a look at the regulators. Well, regulators have that potential to control, legislate, or otherwise influence the organisation's policies and practices. And they fall into two groups, really. We have the regulatory agencies. Now, these are actually created by government to protect the public from business practices, or to protect businesses from each other. And you might think about examples like the Food Standards Agency, or ABTA, or the Monopolies Commission, Working Time Directive, the Living Wage. Secondly, then, we have the interest and the pressure groups. They don't have any official power, but they can actually exert considerable influence on the media, the government, and the general public. Can you think of any? Again, we'll have a talk about this when we meet next week. If we think about the internal environment, well, the internal environment is the owners, the directors, the employees, and the physical work environment. Organisational culture does come into this area, and we're going to look at that area more specifically in a few weeks' time. If we think about the owners, these are the people who have the legal property rights to that business. Perhaps it's a sole trader who establishes and runs a business single-handedly. It could be the partners who jointly run the business. It could be individual investors who buy stocks or shares. Do you know there's over 1 billion shares in McDonald's? And some are owned by other large companies, but thousands are held by individuals. McDonald's also owns shares in Russian farms that grow potatoes which are used for their French fries. If we think about the board of directors, well, this is the governing body elected by the stockholders to oversee the general management to actually ensure it's run best to serve the stockholders' interests, because obviously it's their interests, it's their dividends they're most concerned about. Now some are more actively involved than others, but actually current trend is more and more now being involved in scrutinising and exerting more influence with business, as there's been a whole variety of scandals emerging. And if we think about employees, now obviously an employee is a major element to the internal environment. But the changing nature of today's workforce has really resulted in it becoming more diverse in terms of gender, ethnicity, age and other dimensions. Organisations are now using more and more agency workers, temporary, casual employees for short periods of work, with no expectation of a permanent job, and more flexible for bosses, as is great for flexibility. They can earn less and often have no additional employee benefits. The growth of zero-hour contracts, and what problems do you think this creates? Or does it? Or is it just benefits? Again, we'll discuss this in class. I think often nowadays with employees there's no loyalty to an organisation because they might not be there tomorrow, and there may be no work for them, so perhaps we're actually getting into a two-class workforce. If we think about the physical and work environment, now these can be so varied. It can be a modern tower block, equally an old building. It could be in a rural area or suburban location. Some have long lines of offices, some are totally open planned. Open planned offices is generally the expression used where everybody works in one large office, and often they have hot desking. Hot desking isn't popular, and you can't ever leave anything on the desk. So you tend to find that you have to start each day by getting all your bits and paper, your pens and your staplers together. But of course it's very useful for an employer because it means that with employees not being in the office all the time, the same desk can be used more than once, so you need less office space. And employee safety and health and safety regulations do cause employers to pay more attention to this area.